When Margaret and I retired, we thought we had finally earned a slice of peace. I'd spent 4 decades in courtrooms, working as a judge in both small county disputes and larger federal cases. My wife, Margaret, had given her years to teaching middle school, pouring herself into children who often didn't get much guidance at home. We wanted quiet mornings, a little gardening, evenings with friends, and a lake view from our back porch. We believed we had found that peace when we bought a modest home in a community just outside town. The place had good neighbors, wide sidewalks for walking, and, at least on paper, a well-managed homeowners association. Of course, it didn't take long for us to learn what those 3 letters, HOA, really meant in practice. We'd heard stories before, the ones you laugh at because you assume people are exaggerating. They fined me for leaving a flower pot on the wrong side of the porch, or they told me my mailbox shade was too blue. But soon, we weren't laughing. We were living it. It began with Margaret planting her roses. Gardening had been her passion since before I met her, and even after arthritis slowed her steps, she found joy in working the soil. She placed neat rows of roses in our front yard, trimmed and lovely, in colors that brought life to the neighborhood. Neighbors walking by would stop and compliment them. Children asked if they could pick one for Mother's Day or birthday. Margaret would beam with pride and clip them carefully, always generous. But then came the letter, a typed notice in the mailbox, sealed in the HOA's stern stationery. They claimed the roses violated community aesthetic standards. Apparently, the bylaws only allowed for a narrow list of approved shrubbery: boxwoods, hollies, azaleas, the kind of plants that looked uniform and unremarkable. Roses, in their opinion, were too individual. Margaret crumpled the paper in her hand and muttered, "This is nonsense." She wasn't one to be cowed by rules that made no sense, and she wasn't about to rip out her roses because a committee thought beauty didn't match their handbook. She placed the notice in a drawer and went back outside, watering her flowers as if nothing had happened. A second notice came, this time with a fine, $100 for noncompliance. Margaret ignored it. A third followed, $200 more. She still ignored it. She wasn't defiant out of stubbornness. She was standing on principle. After all, our property taxes were paid, our mortgage settled, and those roses hurt no one. Why should anyone else have the right to dictate beauty in our yard? But then came Karen. Every neighborhood has one. Ours wore oversized sunglasses, had a clipboard under her arm, and always seemed to be prowling the sidewalks for infractions. Karen was a board member of the HOA, and she took her role with the kind of zeal most folks reserve for religion. To her, Margaret's roses were an affront, a rebellion against the sacred bylaws. One afternoon, as Margaret knelt in the dirt pruning, Karen marched up the driveway. "You've been fined multiple times. Do you think you're above the rules?" Margaret looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead, and said in her calm but firm teacher's tone, "No, I just don't think rules that make no sense deserve to be followed." Karen's lips pursed so tightly I thought they might disappear. She stormed off, muttering something about taking this further. The next day, while I was inside reading, Margaret came in from the porch, shaking her head. "You won't believe this. Karen called the police." I thought she was joking, but sure enough, minutes later, a squad car pulled up in front of our house. An officer stepped out, straightening his belt as if preparing for battle. Karen trailed behind him, her arms folded, looking like she had just summoned the cavalry. Margaret stayed seated on the porch, hands folded calmly in her lap. The officer approached with a measured stride, clearly trying to project authority. "Ma'am," he said, "I've received a complaint that you're refusing to comply with your HOA and have been ignoring fines." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Since when is that a criminal matter? Do you arrest people for planting flowers now?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, and then his gaze moved past Margaret toward the doorway, where I had just stepped out. He froze mid-sentence, eyes widening in recognition. His jaw dropped, and he stammered, "J. Judge Miller?" Margaret glanced at me, confused. I stepped forward slowly, hand in my pockets. "Officer Daniels," I said with a slight nod. I remembered him well. I had presided over one of his cases years ago, when he was a young officer accused of excessive force during heated arrest. I'd listened carefully, weighed the evidence, and in the end, I'd cleared his name, pointing out that he had acted within reason under dangerous circumstances. The case could have ended his career, but instead, it allowed him to move forward. Daniels looked like he'd seen a ghost. He quickly straightened up, turned back toward Karen, and lowered his voice. This is a civil matter. It doesn't fall under police jurisdiction. Karen's face flushed red. What do you mean? She's breaking the rules. The HOA has authority. With all due respect, ma'am, Daniels said, his tone suddenly sharp. HOA rules are not criminal law. They can issue civil fines, but that's it. You can't call the police because you don't like someone's flowers. Karen sputtered, pointing at Margaret like a child tattling in school. She's ignoring fines. She thinks she's above everyone else. At that, Daniels turned back toward me. For a moment, it was as if the years of courtroom formality fell away, and he was once again the young man standing nervously in front of my bench. He lowered his voice, almost with reverence. Judge, I didn't realize this was your home. I gave a small smile. It is. And Margaret's roses are staying. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her authority crumbling. She huffed, spun on her heel, and stormed down the driveway without another word. Daniels gave me a nod of respect before returning to his cruiser, and just like that, the little circus was over. But the story didn't end there. Oh no, Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. The HOA board sent more letters, escalating fines into the thousands. They threatened liens, lawsuits, all manner of bluster. That's when I decided enough was enough. I attended the next HOA meeting. The room was filled with homeowners, most of them weary from years of dealing with petty notices and fines. Karen sat at the head of the table, her clipboard like a badge of honor. When she saw me walk in, her face tightened. I waited until the floor opened for discussion. Then I stood. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Judge Miller. I've spent my life interpreting and upholding the law. What your board has been doing isn't law. It's overreach. Roses in a front yard are not a crime, nor should they be treated as one. There were murmurs of agreement around the room. I could see neighbors nodding, exchanging glances, even smiling. I continued. This association was meant to protect property values, not crush individuality. If rules are so rigid that they punish beauty and punish kindness, then those rules need to change. And if the board won't change them, then perhaps it's time to change the board. That last line landed like a hammer. People clapped. Actual applause in an HOA meeting, something I never thought I'd witness. Karen's face turned pale. Within weeks, a petition circulated. Enough signatures were gathered to call a special election. New members replaced the old guard. And when the dust settled, one of the first actions of the new board was to strike the ridiculous landscaping restrictions. Margaret's roses were officially safe. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Sometimes, people like Karen mistake authority for power. They think a title, a rule book, or a clipboard gives them the right to dictate the lives of others. But true authority comes from fairness, from the ability to listen, and from the courage to stand up when something is wrong. For Margaret and me, the victory wasn't just about roses. It was about dignity, about proving that even in retirement, when the world sometimes tries to push older folks aside, we still had a voice. A strong one. And maybe that was the real beauty in those roses. They reminded us, and everyone else, that you should never be too quick to surrender what makes life worth living. The roses still bloom today, brighter than ever. And every time a neighbor walks by and smiles, Margaret beams with pride. Sometimes small rebellions, like refusing to rip out a flower, teach the biggest lessons.